Ben Edgerly-Walsh from VPIRG, thank you so much for joining today. I'm seeing people pop in very rapidly. We had quite a lot of interest in today's webinar, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started with introductions, and I'll trust that folks will be on for the actual meat and potatoes of this so that no one will miss the substance. So again, my name is Ben Edgerly-Walsh. I run VPIRG's Climate and Energy program. I'll be moderating this panel today, and I am joined by 4 other wonderful panelists who are all members of the Vermont Climate Council. And of course, you know that's why you're here today, hearing an update about the council's work. I'll get more into the agenda in a moment, but just wanted to quickly introduce folks. I'm going to do it in the order that folks will be speaking today. So first, we've got Jared Duval, who's the Executive Director. Thank you, Jared, for joining of Energy Action Network. He's a council member appointed from, quote, a Vermont-based organization with expertise in energy and data analysis. It's a mouthful, but that's what the law says, and he definitely hits that out of the park. He's also a co-chair of the Science and Data Subcommittee and a member of the council's steering committee. Next, we've got Kelly Klein, who's the founder and CEO of Groeneveld Meadery and the small business representative on the council, and is also a member of the Just Transition Subcommittee. Welcome, Kelly. We've got Lauren Oates, Interim Director of Government Relations and Policy from the Nature Conservancy's Vermont chapter, and is the member with expertise in the design and implementation of programs to increase resilience to and respond to natural disasters resulting from climate change. Again, tons of expertise in that area. Real pleasure to have you. She's also a member of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee and is on the council's steering committee. And then last but not least, we've got Johanna Miller, Joey Miller, who is the Energy and Climate Program Director at BNRC and the council member representing a statewide environmental organization. She is on cross-sector mitigation and is leading the council's transportation work group. Thank you all so much for joining us today. So just going to quickly touch on the agenda, and then I'm going to kick it over to Jared. So everyone, if you signed up for this, obviously you know we're here to get an update on the Climate Council's work from actual climate counselors. And right now is really a critical time to be getting this kind of context or background, because there is a lot going on, a lot of public engagement opportunities right now around the council. And knowing our members, knowing the Vermont public, we know that you want to know what you're talking about when you're engaging with something like the Vermont Climate Council. So we wanted to get you up to speed. So we're going to be following up with a lot more information, obviously in 5, 6, 7 minutes for some really big topics. We're only going to be able to give you the cliff notes today, but we will be following up with a lot more information, how to go to the virtual public engagement meetings that are coming up, the emails for individual counselors you can contact, and websites for the specific subcommittees that you might be interested in digging into the work of. And we'll continue to be in touch in the coming days and weeks with more information as it becomes available. I did want to just quickly touch, and I'll say this again at the end, and again, we'll email them as well, but on the 3 virtual public hearings that are coming up. One is this Thursday, the 30th from 6 to 7:30. There's also one next week, Wednesday, the 6th from 6 to 7:30. And there's one specifically focused on getting the input of BIPOC Vermonters. That will be Tuesday, the 5th, also from 6 to 7:30. So thank you all again so much for being here. And without further ado, Jared, we would love to hear what's going on in the Science and Data Subcommittee.
Thank you, Ben. Good to be with you all. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, actually it says it's disabled. So either that can be enabled, or Ian, if you don't mind pulling up that one slide, or I can try again.
I'll pull up the slide. Apologies for that.
Thanks, Ian. So the Science and Data Subcommittee really exists in service to the other subcommittees. And we're really a clearinghouse, a group that is coming together to try and identify areas where having common language, common understanding, transparency around a lot of the technical science and data related issues in service of the council are happening. And so one of the places that we start is with the greenhouse, that we have started is with the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and what related supplemental analysis will be really necessary for the council to be looking at to complement the existing greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So while that slide is coming up, I will just, as a refresher, remind folks that in the law, in the Global Warming Solutions Act, it sets 3 key emissions reduction requirements. By 2025, a 26% reduction in emissions below our 2005 levels. That is in line with the United States commitment with regard to the Paris Climate Commitment. There is a second target in 2030 of 40% below 1990 emissions levels. And I would just note here that while 40% doesn't sound that much larger than 26%, the baseline year change matters a lot because our emissions were a lot lower in 1990 than they were in 2005. So when you do that math, the emissions reduction, the scale of emissions reduction that we need to achieve by 2030 is nearly 3 times as large as we do by 2025. And then there is also a target for 2050, a requirement of 80% below 1990 levels. The law also talks about achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And so there's also work that the Science and Data Subcommittee, and I think Lauren may touch on in the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, to develop a carbon budget. So we know not just ways to track our gross greenhouse gas emissions, but also sources of sequestration so we can count net emissions and figure out when and how we will be aligned, not just with the gross emissions reduction requirements, which you see here on the screen, but also that net zero target by 2050. So a few key things that the Science and Data Subcommittee has done. We've started with a review of the state's official greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And we have affirmed that it is necessary and appropriate to have a methodology, as we do, that looks at the emissions that occur within the borders of the state of Vermont. This is often known as an in-boundary or a sector-based inventory that is in line with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Protocol, as well as EPA guidance, which allows us to compare our emissions and our where we've stood historically and where we will be in future years with other states and with other countries. At the same time, we realize that we can be fairly understood to be responsible for emissions that occur as a result of our decisions in Vermont, but where the emissions may happen elsewhere. So for instance, if we purchase energy in Vermont that is produced elsewhere, there are emissions along that supply chain, often known as upstream or life cycle emissions. So we are moving ahead with designing a request for information, an RFI, so that we can get technical support to, in addition to this official in-boundary inventory that's aligned with the IPCC and EPA, also have more transparency and knowledge about our upstream or life cycle emissions related to the energy use in Vermont. So that is moving forward. Another key area of focus for the Science and Data Subcommittee has been making recommendations on using a social cost of carbon. This is really important because when the council does cost effectiveness analysis, the law, the Global Warming Solutions Act, talks about cost effective emissions reduction in addition to technically feasible and equitable greenhouse gas emissions reduction. But it's really important that when we do cost effectiveness analysis or benefit cost analysis, that we're aware of the consequences of our pollution and the costs that creates to society. And so we have recommended, and the council has adopted, a global damage-based assessment for a social cost of carbon, including utilizing a discount rate that really accounts for the impacts, not just globally, but also, and not just on this generation, but on generations to come. And those recommendations are in line with the Biden administration's federal interagency working group in line with what the state of New York is doing, but we will also have analysis that allows us to see what that social cost of carbon would be if you made different assumptions or choices, including around the crucial choice of discount rate. I'll just note really briefly that those recommendations on the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and supplemental analysis and on the social cost of carbon are available on the Climate Council website. After I finish talking, I'll put those links in the chat, and I'm sure, I think Ian or Johanna will put them in a follow-up email. Another key thing that's happening on the Science and Data Subcommittee is that we are really lucky to have the expertise and leadership of Dr. Leslie Ann Dupini-Giroux, who is the Vermont state climatologist, along with Dr. Jay Schaefer at Northern Vermont University, and they will be drafting a chapter that will be at the forefront of the climate action plan on climate change in Vermont. And so they are also leading up that effort. But in the interest of time, I know that we're sticking to Cliff Notes and I'm already over. I'm going to pause there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jared. And I did actually want to ask you one more question that is a little bit higher level, and really I should have started with, so my apologies to everyone. Anyone sort of tuning into the Climate Council right now might have gotten a little bit lost as we jumped right into the middle of it. I know you touched on some of the sort of high level targets, what's in the actual law. It would be great if you could just give a quick update for folks on where are we at in the timeline, what's going to happen over the next couple of months, just sort of get level set people on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Sorry for diving right in. So the overall timeline is that the initial climate action plan is due by December 1st. And so all of the subcommittees are right now surfacing their draft recommendations, are incorporating some of the public feedback and input that is happening through these public engagement sessions, more of which are still to come. And then we're going to be involved in drafting the climate action plan, and different subcommittees, different counselors are taking on different sections of that plan, depending on their area of focus or expertise. And so that's the high level timeline, is working towards this December 1st initial plan. I will also say, though, because I think that it's underappreciated, that the appointees to the Climate Council were appointed either for 2 or 3 year terms, and the council is meant to exist on an ongoing basis. And we have a responsibility not just to develop this initial climate action plan, but to put forward future revisions to that plan and to develop subsequent plans. So while this plan will need to meet the legal requirements as outlined in the Global Warming Solutions Act, the work will not be done, and we will need to build on that and add to it in the months and years to come as well.
Thanks so much, Jared. Kelly, I'm going to kick it over to you in just a moment. But before I do, I just want to underscore that point that Jared just made. In particular, there is an expectation, and then the council has really discussed, actually, like right after that December 1st date, continuing to do public engagement, getting feedback on the plan that is released on December 1st, and actually doing a fairly rapid turnaround on a revised, sort of built on and refined plan early in 2022. So expect to hear more about this after that December 1st plan, and be hearing from all of us about why it's really important to stay engaged after that December 1st plan. This isn't like a report that the legislature's getting and then everyone's walking away from. So without further ado, because we are running over, as Jared noted, I would love to turn it over to Kelly Klein. Kelly, what can you tell us about the critical work that the Just Transition Subcommittee is doing?
Thanks, Ben. So yes, the Just Transitions Committee is a little bit different from the other committees that we have, because what we've been tasked with is helping to make sure that we have good public engagement and giving guidance and support to the other committees in making sure that the policies and proposals that they're putting forward are going to have a focus on equity, and making sure that they both don't have undue impacts on people who are already overburdened, frontline and impacted communities. And also hopefully that some of the things we're putting forward can give additional benefits to people who are already overly impacted. So the committee was formed, we tried to do our best to get the most diverse group of people we could, and not just racially and ethnically diverse, but also geographically diverse. We have, some age diversity. We have a member who's actually in high school and she's amazing. So I have some hope for the future if her peers are anything like her. So we tried to form a committee that really had good representation. We have someone who is able to represent the low and moderate income communities. We have someone who can help represent workers and unions. And so with this wonderful group of people, the biggest thing that we worked on was putting together principles for a just transition. So some guiding principles that the other committees can use as they're developing recommendations to do a bit of a gut check and say, are we going to put undue burdens on various different groups, or is this going to be a good policy that's going to uplift people who have been burdened in the past? Basic overview of that is that, who are these communities that we're working on supporting or making sure that we're not burdening. So it would be people who are highly exposed to climate risks, such as health impacts, flooding, or extreme temperatures, people who experience racism and oppression or are excluded from opportunities traditionally, or just have fewer resources to adapt to climate and economic change. People who bear the brunt of pollution and negative effects from fossil fuel and extractive economies, and also people who are more likely to experience a job transition as Vermont addresses climate change. And so we talked a lot about that, and then came up with some guiding principles that are to help people think about how we can be inclusive and transparent and engage the public, and that these actions are going to be accountable to what the outcomes are going to be, and will help restore people to a better way of life, rather than have too many negative impacts, especially on people who are already overburdened. And then, recognizing that we need to gain trust and solidarity, and sometimes wanting to just steam ahead is going to leave people behind. So trying to really think about moving at the speed of where we can really engage people and ask the tough questions and hear people's stories from their mouths. And trying to focus on making sure that we address the needs of the people who are already the most impacted first, which I mentioned earlier, and also supporting our workers, our families, and our communities in this transition. So there are self-assessment questions, such as, if you're looking at a policy and you're thinking about putting it in place, saying which frontline and impacted communities might be most impacted by this recommendation. Does this recommendation maintain existing inequalities, make them worse, or does it improve the status quo? And various questions like that. And then the last piece of this was a rubric that allows people to go through and sort of ask those questions of themselves and score a policy on these different guidelines and these different questions. And so the hope is that if you go through this analysis and you realize that your score on this policy proposal isn't great, you may be able to identify things that you could modify to make it work better and make it so that the people who are already overburdened are not getting further burdened. Or you may identify this is maybe not a great idea for equity and we should not go forward with this proposal. It may seem like a great thing for, it's inexpensive and it's going to make a big impact, but if it's, on the climate, but if it's going to make a really big negative impact on our communities and our people, then that may be an indication that that's not something we should move forward with. So it's a really interesting tool, and afterwards we'll send you the link to look at this entire document. It took a lot of hours and a lot of thoughtful back and forth, and I feel really proud of the work that the committee did to put this together. The other piece of what we do, as I said, is helping to make sure that we have good public engagement. Oh, and before I move to that, we also have, I'm really excited, we have a consultant who is going to help the committees go through using this tool and really trying to think through the policies that the other committees are putting forward to the full council. And so that's the biggest thing, is that it's not just going to be this like, okay, here you go, have fun, guys. You figure out whether you're doing things that are unfair or unequal. The consultant will help people walk through it and really think about think outside of their normal day-to-day life and think about other impacted communities and who might need to be uplifted in these decisions. So then another consultant we have is the for public engagement. We have two consultants working together, Climate Access and RISE. And as Ben mentioned, there are several opportunities for public engagement around the state. And these are geared towards peers being able to talk with peers. And so it's not just the Climate Council saying, here's what we're doing, what do you think? There's more of inviting discussion, people sharing their own stories and their own experiences. And that's part of the reason that we have the BIPOC only public engagement event, because it is really important, we feel, to have a safe space where it is members of the BIPOC community who can just share their stories and talk and not feel like they are, and feel like they can really just bring it all forward. And we know that members of the BIPOC community have been usually the people who don't get the benefits in any sort of big transition. And we're facing one with the climate change in general, and also the things we're going to do to mitigate climate change will also impact people. And so hearing people's stories rather than trying to guess about what impacts people are feeling without having actually asked is a really important part of this process as well. And so this feedback is going to continually be brought in and incorporated into the way that the policies are being shaped this year and even into the future. So I think that's sort of the very high level overview. I'll hand it back over to you, Ben.
Thanks so much, Kelly. And I saw some questions in the chat. We are going to be sending around the principles, the rubric. There's also a good presentation that was given at the last full Climate Council meeting on sort of the evolution of that. So we can send around that to all registrants. I also dropped what I believe is the final Just Transitions Principles document in the chat. Next, we are going to turn to agriculture and ecosystems, as well as rural resilience. Lauren is going to be doing double duty today, so we'll give her a little bit of extra time to try to cover all of that ground. Though again, we're going to be having to stay relatively high level. Thanks so much, Lauren.
Thanks, Ben. And what Ben didn't say is I'm not actually a member of Rural Resilience and Adaptation. So I will endeavor to do my best to represent the good work that they have been doing for these past 8 or 9 months. But just to let you all know, I'm not actually in that group, so I can speak a little bit more detailed for agriculture and ecosystems than I can for Rural Resilience and Adaptation. And before I ask Ian to share his screen, I just want to point out that today is my first day back in my office. And I don't know if you all can see this, but I just thought everyone should see how silly this is, that this is what I walked into to see today. Anyway, just a reminder of where we are in this strange world that we're all living in. Ian, thank you, that was quick. So as I mentioned, as Ben mentioned for me, my name is Lauren Oates. I'm the Interim Director of Government Relations and Policy for the Nature Conservancy. I am also on the Vermont Climate Council, the Steering Committee, and the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. There is an asterisk next to Rural Resilience and Adaptation because I've been asked to give a high-level overview of where they are. But here are 2 photos that kind of represent the work that we're doing in each of them. If you could go to the next slide, please. I'll start with what I know best. So agriculture and ecosystems. I'm not going to read through the words on the screen, but those are our high-level pathways, or what we see happening in each of the different respective opportunity buckets. So things like, growing our natural and working lands workforce, growing the economies and the markets that relate to them, restoring our natural resources, improving the ability of our natural and working lands to store and sequester carbon, and a few other things. It's been a lot of work. Our subcommittee has been meeting every Friday since, I believe, February. Hopefully we'll be able to put in the chat at some point in time links to how you can access those meetings. But We've had a lot of members of the public join, provide a lot of feedback throughout the way. We also just hosted the last 2 weeks a couple of stakeholder engagement opportunities. So beyond the public outreach efforts that have been ongoing the last week, the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee hosted 2 events for forests and forestry industry. We hosted one for farmers. And when I get to rural resilience, I'll talk a bit about the one that they just hosted last week. But it was really nice beyond the public that join the meetings each time to actually go to the people who are doing the work on the ground, the practitioners in their fields, and hearing from them the things that they're excited about, the things that they're concerned by, and the opportunities that lie with building a more equitable and resilient climate future in those economies. For agriculture and ecosystems, I can't yet unfortunately give you a list of our priority actions. We still haven't begun the prioritization process. As Kelly just mentioned, we are excited to have an equity consultant who's going to come in and assist us with the equity piece, but we will also be looking at things like co-benefit opportunities, cost effectiveness of different strategies and actions, and a handful of other prioritization framework that we're still working out at the steering committee and full council scale. But we are looking at a couple of things, many things, actually over 100 actions currently, a lot around, again, workforce development for our natural and working lands economy, more specific things like fully funding Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, implementing the Vermont Farm to Plate plan, creating a payment for ecosystem services to actually reward and incentivize farmers and forestry members for doing things on the ground that not only reduce their emissions potentially, but also expand their capacity while also restoring the ecosystem services that their land might be able to avail themselves. We also are doing some things in the policy realm, recommending actions that might implement a statewide land use plan or tweaks to Act 250 or the used value appraisal or current use program. So a lot of things across the board. Very, very excited by the work that we're doing. Still quite a bit of work ahead, not only to get us to December 1, as Jared mentioned, but beyond that, looking at implementation and opportunities both with state agencies as well as individual Vermonters and NGOs and the private sector, because this isn't definitely an all hands on deck type of effort. Next slide. So Rural Resilience and Adaptation, they have been also meeting every Friday or nearly every Friday since the beginning of this calendar year. They are working on a handful of pathways as well. Those are on the screen for you there. I can't, as I said, dive that deeply into the actions that they're doing, but there is quite a bit of good information there. It's also available on the climatechange.vermont.gov website, which is relatively new. A lot of the actions and strategies of that subcommittee you'll see are related to building out the resilience of our built environment. So how we can make sure that we're building a resilient transportation system, how we're creating resilient and equitable, affordable housing, communications infrastructure in general, the types of things that we see, both broadband access statewide, as well as the impacts that extreme flooding, wind, changing seasons, all of the things that climate change is bringing to us both today and in the future, creating resilient strategies around those opportunity areas. Both agriculture and ecosystems, as well as rural resilience and adaptation, have a lot of overlap in the strategies and actions that we're working on, especially with respect to how we can use our land and empower our land to create more resilient, not only natural systems, but communities as well. Each of our subcommittees have a lot of actions around education and outreach opportunities, technical assistance needs, and then there are a lot about the mapping gaps that we have in the state and the needs that we might have around creating better mapping to better understand how we create more resilient land use plans, both at the municipal, regional, and potentially state scale. And as I said, with the outreach stakeholder events that agriculture and ecosystems just hosted, Rural Resilience and Adaptation recently hosted an event for rural municipal governments, and all 4 of those events were really, really well attended. I think between 70 and 120 people from across Vermont came to each of those. So we got a lot of good feedback there and are working as our individual subcommittees now to figure out how best to incorporate that, while also understanding that we have just about 2 months left to finish our actions, prioritize them, and elevate them into the final climate action plan process. I think that is it for me.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Last, but again, certainly not least, Joey, I know there's a lot in there, as in all of these subcommittees, but it would be great to get an update on cross-sector. And just if you could tell people what cross-sector mitigation is.
I certainly plan to. It is not necessarily intuitive. Thank you, Ben. Anyway, thanks for being here today. Johanna Miller, Joey. I lead the Energy and Climate Program at VNRC. And yes, I am a member of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee of the Climate Council, which is a complicated way of saying the subcommittee that's looking at the sort of sectoral strategies, looking at the transportation, thermal, electric generation and supply, and the non-energy sector. So it's a big, important piece of work, and it's a big endeavor, and it will. I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit more about it. So just to put a finer point on what it actually is, cross-sector, again, focus on transportation, thermal, ag, industrial processes, electricity, and waste management. And I'm borrowing from the Energy Action Network's materials here just to share with you what I'm sure you are probably well aware of, that transportation is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. The building, how we heat our homes and buildings, the second largest source. Cumulatively, the ag and industrial processes sector, the third largest source, and then the electric sector. So this is the sectoral focus that we are looking into in cross-sector mitigation. There is a lot to cover, and yet there's a lot of ground that has been laid in this state through 2 previous climate action plans, 2 comprehensive energy plans, and a lot of other really important work. So I am going to give you a sense of what we're talking about. I'm helping to lead the transportation task group with my fantastic colleague, Gina Campoli, and we are really looking at increasing the efficiency of the transportation network broadly, and increasing the efficiency and pivoting towards more clean electric vehicles. So at a very high level, really looking at vehicle electrification for light, medium, heavy duty vehicles, increasing the efficiency of existing car fleets, getting people into more higher mile per gallon vehicles, giving people options to get out of their cars and use other modes of transportation to get where they need to go, whether that's transit or microtransit, biking, walking, carpooling, telecommuting, et cetera. And fundamental to that is really an important focus on smart growth and land use, really building the kinds of communities where people can walk to work, can live closer to where they work, and live closer to where they need to go. And for us, that's a really important focus. I mean, affordable housing and housing choice is really critical to that. And at the same time, for all the many values that Lauren in particular just highlighted, really protecting the working lands and our farms, forests, and other natural resource assets outside of our village centers for all the different myriad benefits that they offer. When it comes to transportation, obviously it's a huge sector, again, 40%. We have a lot of different recommended actions, and there's nuance to these strategies, and there's a lot more than what is on this screen. But some of the fundamental things that we're putting on the table is for Vermont to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative. It's a regional cap and invest program that our neighbors like Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island are pursuing. It will help us reduce emissions over a decade in the transportation sector, but more importantly, it will raise approximately $20 million annually to fund the programs that we recognize are essential to move us forward. While we're recommending and putting the TCI on the table, we are also recognizing that we are fundamentally committed to making this an equitable and just transition. So recommending a complementary policy to ensure equitable outcomes and much better process. A few high-level things, continuing our participation in the low emission vehicle and zero emission vehicle programs and the California emission standards that really set a frame for ensuring that our fleets are more clean, and we can access those clean, more efficient vehicles for Vermonters. And then really sort of setting the stage for this transition by incentivizing and expanding the needed programs that we have. So we have some great programs to build in the state of Vermont, and much more work to do to expand those programs. And then, as I noted before, really making sort of critical investments in our community centers, in transportation systems and in village wastewater, water treatment systems, so that we can get to the smart growth outcomes that we are looking for long-term progress. Second largest sector, the buildings and thermal sector, really looking at how we make our buildings more efficient, and then how we heat and cool those buildings with more clean, renewable resources. Some of the big ideas on the table, I am not leading that work. There are amazing people who are, but it's really looking at weatherizing our home, the sort of concept of weatherization at scale, weatherizing 120,000 homes in the next decade, really helping people make their homes more efficient, healthy, comfortable. So that's a huge greenhouse gas emissions opportunity. Simultaneously, there is exploration of a clean heat standard, a performance measure for fossil fuel heating providers to meet, so that we can clean up, make far more progress incrementally in terms of the heat that we use. Also on the table, importantly, building codes and efficiency standards, including for rental properties, as well as incentivizing a transition to cleaner heating solutions, such as heat pumps, pellet stoves, wood chip boilers. And I say it here, but I say it fundamentally as really been an important piece of the conversation, and a really important piece of the work that we're going to do with the equity consultant and in general is sort of layer this equity screen across every single action, so that we can really prioritize more lower income, overburdened, historically marginalized Vermonters in this suite of solutions. Also, just to note, really looking at the electric sector and sort of expanding and building out a clean, reliable energy system in the state of Vermont, a more resilient energy grid for more energy independence, and all the resilience benefits that that could offer. On the table is the pursuit of 100% renewable energy standard, replacing the existing one, looking at really encouraging electrification through rate design, and doing a lot of the things that I just mentioned, because a lot of these issues are really integral and integrated. So looking at weatherization and converting to heat pumps and setting the stage to do that, as well as looking at things like community resilience zones to deliver more local energy generation and storage. So there's a lot of big, important concepts on the table. And then lastly, looking at reducing the carbon intensity from the waste and industrial process sectors, really looking at how do we make the wastewater treatment facilities in the state of Vermont, for example, more, reduce the energy consumption that they use at those facilities, as well as, the transport of wastewater to those facilities to process, and reducing the carbon intensity of hydrofluorocarbons that are in the refrigeration systems that we all use in Vermont. There are a lot of different components to all of this work, and I'm flying incredibly high at the moment, but I really want to get to the question and answer segment, and I really look forward to following up with far more detail, but that is a snapshot of the work we're doing in the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee.
Thank you so much, Joey. So I'm going to touch on just a little bit before we start the Q&A. Sorry about that light. In answer to the question in the chat right there, yeah, we can definitely make these slides available, and a lot of them are pulled from sort of other places, and we'll be sharing the full council website where you can find a lot of information about all of this. But again, before we dig into the Q&A, I wanted to just touch on what is sort of the advocacy environmental community, however you want to describe organizations like VPIRG and VNRC and all the rest of us who are also pressing the Climate Council to get this job done and do it in a way that really cuts our carbon pollution and advances equity in the way it needs to. What are we focused on when we're advocating at the council? What are we urging our members to suggest the council should really prioritize? So I'm going to touch on a few of those things quickly. and then we'll shift to the Q&A and wrap up. So really there are three things. You could really boil it down to two things if you wanted to, that we're focused on. One, the plan needs to cut carbon pollution across Vermont's economy in line with the Solutions Act's requirements and what climate science demands. Two, the plan needs to do that equitably so that everyone benefits from this transition. And then number three, the plan needs to support real, significant, long-term funding sources so that 1 and 2 can actually happen. The last thing I'll note quickly is we need to be really focused on the data, the science behind not just carbon pollution, but also advancing equity. Those are fields that both have incredibly robust evidence-based programs and solutions available. And we need to be just as serious about the science and data behind equity as we are about the science and data behind carbon pollution. And if we're serious, we're going to be doing a lot right now, like very, very soon in the next legislative session and next year through rulemaking. We're going to make sure that there's data collection and mapping necessary to actually understand how effective we're being on both of these fronts. And then we're going to go back and revise and build on what we learned so that we can do more and we can do it better so we can hit the even higher targets in 2030 that Jared was talking about. I also know folks are probably wondering, what specific policies, those sort of high level principles are great, but what specific policies are we advocating for? We definitely don't have time to get into all of them right now. You've heard about some of them already, but I will just touch on a few. Obviously, Vermont needs to adopt an environmental justice policy. About 30 states have, Vermont has not. That's a real problem. That needs to be remedied this coming year. Just and equitably implemented transportation and climate initiative, far more new and in-state renewable energy, funding and financing to enable weatherization and cold climate heat pumps and other efficient electric heat, at scale, 100,000 plus homes weatherized with efficient electric heat over the next decade. So these are the kinds of actions we're advocating for. And again, we're definitely going to be in touch with more detail on all these later. But with that, I wanted to shift to the question and answer. And then before we wrap, I'm just going to touch on the opportunities to actually share your perspective with the Climate Council. Before we get into the Q&A, let me just say there were way more questions than we're going to be able to get to in the next 15 minutes. We do have a hard stop at 1 p.m. And I will also say a lot of the questions that we were getting, I was seeing a number of things on Hydro-Quebec, on natural gas, on biomass. These are things that you should be showing up to the public engagement meetings. I'm sure a lot of you have already showed up to the in-person ones. If you haven't, definitely show up to one of the virtual ones and sharing those questions, those concerns, that feedback with the Climate Council itself. That's really, where the rubber hits the road. Those of us on this webinar, obviously we've got a subsection of the council here. We're seeing your questions and concerns. I'm seeing them and I can incorporate them into VPIRG's work, but really it's about that public engagement that they're doing right now. So I hope that you will show up to those and ask all the same questions over the next week at those opportunities. So I want to ask actually a couple of questions that were related right up top because they're very high level and I think probably applicable to everyone's sort of understanding of what's going on here. One is, once the Climate Council report is submitted, what force does it have? Is it advisory to the legislature and administration, or does it have more impact than that? And then related, is the plan meant to be for a certain amount of time? Is it a 5-year plan, a 3-year plan, et cetera? So I'm just going to throw that out. Anyone, Joey, Jared, anyone else want to take a crack at that?
I will take a crack at it. So once the plan is implemented, this will be an initial plan. It will be iterative, and it will go out for public comment as well right after it's due on December 1st. So there'll be more opportunity for input. At the same time, the plan will compel the Agency of Natural Resources to begin rulemaking on things in the plan under their purview. It will also set a tone and I think be an important, sort of partner resource to the legislature as they, grapple this coming session with what to do with these federal dollars. I hope the plan will inform that, as well as also the plan will identify some very key strategies that the legislature could act on when they return in January. And then the plan, as I noted, the Climate Council is appointed for 3-year terms. This entire endeavor is operationalized in state government in a way that no other climate action endeavor has been in Vermont. So this will be a living and breathing process and product. But it is, it does have the force of law. We have to deliver a plan that actually meets the pollution reduction requirements identified in the plan, as well as meets the other priorities identified in the plan related to resilience, adaptation, and equity.
If it's all right, I'll just add to that quickly that the Global Warming Solutions Act says that the plan is due on or before December 1st, 2021, but also that the plan shall be updated on or before July 1st every 4 years thereafter. So it could come sooner, but the idea is that the plan the existing plan that is approved this year would then be updated at least every 4 years thereafter.
Thanks very much, Jared. I'm going to try to just knock off a couple quickly. And if any of you counselors feel like I'm missing anything here, please feel free. One person was asking about the construction industry and sort of where does that fit? It's such a big contributor globally. Why is that sort of not being covered? And just to be clear, it is being covered. It's just being covered sort of in the electric sector, the transportation sector, and the buildings and thermal sector. Really, and then sort of industrial and process sector. Pretty much everything that the construction industry is doing is going to be covered by one of the buckets that the council is working within. It's just not being sort of sliced and diced in that same way. And then the other one, and Jared already partly answered this in the chat, but I think it's worth everyone hearing in case you're not on chat. There's a question around the different benchmarks and dates. Why is it 26% from 2005 by 2025, and then you're switching to a 1990 baseline for 2030? The short answer is the US had very clear commitments under the Paris Climate Accord for 2025. So the legislature went ahead and endorsed those and made those Vermont's own goals. And then for the 2030 and 2050 dates, the legislature tried to hew fairly close to the targets that Vermont already had aspirationally in statute. And so that's why those started with a 1990 baseline. And then I'll just emphasize the point that Jared made. Having a 1990 baseline actually makes it much harder to hit those same targets because they're more ambitious than if we were starting at that sort of peak level of 2005 emissions. Jared, anything I missed there? Do you want to clean that up at all? Okay, great. So I'm just going back to the top, making sure I'm not missing any of these questions. I will also, to our counselors here, if you're seeing any questions that came in through the chat that you're, really want to answer, please feel free to unmute and chime in. But while I'm telling you to do that, let me just take a quick look here.
While you're looking through that, Ben, I'll just note there was an early question about whether or not military use of fuel is counted in the inventory, and just want to assure folks that if any fuel that is purchased within the state of Vermont's borders is going to be counted in the Vermont greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Our estimates for the greenhouse gas emissions are very much based on total, among other things, but especially in the transportation and thermal sectors, very much based on total fuel sales within the state borders. And that would include aviation fuels, it would include diesel, it would include anything along those lines. So I hope that's helpful. And I'd also say that while I think it is helpful to look at international and national guidance on opportunities for where we need to reduce emissions, Vermont is also very unique compared to other states and countries in terms of where our emissions come from. We have a lot more of our emissions coming from how we get around and heat our homes and buildings, so transportation and heating in particular, than most other places. 74% of our total greenhouse gas emissions come from the fossil fuel we use for transportation and building heating. So while it is important to look at what other places are doing, what they're learning, their emissions reduction strategies, we also need to do it within the specific context of Vermont, where most of our pollution is coming from.
Ben, can I just add something to a really important point? Thank you, Jared. I wanted to mention, because it's come up in my transportation work and the conversations and more broadly in the council, and some of your questions are sort of pointing to this. There are some things that don't fit as tidily into the sort of sectoral way that we have organized ourselves as a council that I think many of us have identified as fundamentally important, or critical to actually implementing the programs, the policies, the plans, the recommendations we're putting forward, and or enabling them to happen. And that really relates to funding and financing. How are we going to pay for these things? Incenting the things that we want people to do more of, and sending price signals to reduce our reliance on the imported fossil fuels we collectively use. And then also setting really important frameworks like an environmental justice policy, like Ben noted, and investing in capacity, investing in state government to partner with Vermonters in this entire endeavor, and investing in important partners at the local level, like our regional planning commissions and community action agencies who do this work and interface with Vermonters and community groups that are fundamental to actually making these recommendations actionable on the ground. So, workforce and like regional coordination, there are several of those bigger things that are 100% fundamental to our success. And I just wanted to recognize that and respond to Deirdre Holmes, for example, who are asking how energy committees can help. There are going to be a lot of ways, and we really look forward to identifying what that looks like as we partner with the network of community energy committees, but also as we capacitize other key partners in this endeavor.
Thanks so much, Joey. We only have a few minutes left, but definitely can cover a couple more questions before we have to wrap. I think this actually is also one for Joey. I always hate it when one panelist gets sort of all the airtime, but that is the way it tends to play out. So one, and I don't have the name of the person who put this out there, so apologies for that. One of the questions was better to reduce the number of miles traveled, both passenger and vehicle miles, than drive miles more efficiently. That's a whole separate issue. How is the council addressing this need/opportunity? Joey, could you touch on that briefly?
Yeah, I would say, and it relates to a lot of the work that Lauren highlighted, sort of the land use, smart growth, resilience, adaptation strategies. So in the transportation world, we're recognizing that, Vermonters rely on cars to get where they need to go. So not everyone is moving into a compact community settlement overnight. So we are going to have to rely on vehicles, at least in the short term, to get people where they need to go. So making sure that those are cleaner vehicles, electric vehicles, that they are more efficient vehicles, supporting, programs like the Replace Your Ride program, and like in the mileage smart programs that helps lower income Vermonters get into more fuel efficient vehicles as a stepped part of this transition. We fundamentally need land use strategies and that make it easier for people to reduce reliance on an automobile, period. So, but at this moment in time, it is a both and strategy. And as Jared noted, I mean, this is an iterative plan, and we're going to do more of this work over time to try and create opportunities to get people out of vehicles. But that is not the moment we are in.
Fair enough. So there were also a couple of questions around sort of natural resource impacts. Without getting into particular wording and particular questions, Lauren, it'd be great if you could talk just a little bit more about how the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee and Rural Resilience are digging into and planning on addressing the impacts of just development generally here in Vermont on our natural resources as we move forward.
Sure. Well, unsurprisingly, and to support what Joey just mentioned, a lot of the strategies to actually protect our natural resources are available through elevating compact settlement. So there are myriad co-benefits that come along with ensuring that we create a space for compact settlement, not only for equitable access to jobs, housing, infrastructure, but also to protect those more natural spaces for farmers to be able to work their lands, et cetera. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of the work that we're doing, not only compact settlement, but also identifying data gaps and needs. And there is a big opportunity among future mapping mapping for the state of Vermont to understand where our natural resources, where habitat connectivity is really, really necessary in a changing climate, where the best place to potentially site renewable energy should be located. Different opportunities like that can be created and understood best through climate resilient zones, like Joey mentioned, understanding the tensions between human development and natural resources impacts, as well as impacts to those sectors that really need to be able to work from and off of the land. I'd say that beyond the mapping opportunity, there's been obviously a loss of forests over the past several decades, and the need to create space for our forests to grow again and to be able to exist both in a well-managed space, but also wild forests. And understanding that there's always going to be that tension between development and where we could and should go, and where we are best to leave the land to itself.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap the Q&A here. We have just a couple of minutes left. Let me just acknowledge very explicitly, we didn't get into some of the sort of stickiest, most meaty, I mean, not to say that the questions that we answered were not very, very important, but some of the issues that were brought up, like Hydro-Quebec, biomass, natural gas, fracked gas, are things that we could spend, as everyone here knows, all day talking about. Again, I would strongly urge you to show up to these virtual meetings, fill out the web survey, give the council your feedback on those topics. I have no doubt that the 100+ people on this webinar know an immense amount, and really the Climate Council could benefit from you sharing your perspective and your expertise with them. So let me just wrap by touching on that again. Again, there are 3 virtual hearings coming up. One is this Thursday, the 30th from 6 to 7:30, next Wednesday, the 6th, also from 6 to 7:30. And then this coming Tuesday, not tomorrow, October 5th from 6 to 7:30, there will be one specifically for BIPOC Vermonters looking to get their feedback on this plan. My one piece of advice, and then I'll recap our recommendations as far as what the council needs to hear at a high level. My one piece of advice here, just show up. You just spent an hour on a climate webinar. You can spend another hour impacting this climate plan. Please do that. If you have specific advice for the policies that the council is going to be pursuing, that's great. If you don't, that's also great. Just showing up and saying you need to take this very seriously, get the job done from a climate standpoint and equity standpoint, that is really important for them to hear as well, even if you don't feel like you have the right answer on which policy. So please show up. We'll share all the details afterwards over email. And then again, the top line things that the council needs to be doing: hitting our climate targets, advancing equity, doing both of those in a data and science driven way, and funding both of those adequately so that we can actually get this job done. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you to all of our panelists. And I deeply appreciate the work that everyone on this webinar, and just to be clear, I'm talking about those of you in the audience, have been and will continue to do to get climate action done in Vermont. Have a good day.